Well, one correction, there's a newer publication, Grasping the Donkey's Tail, that is also by Singing Dragon Press. Whoever's monitoring the audio, can you folks hear me in the back? I have a very non-projectile voice. Is it just not working or it's not loud enough? It's working but not loud enough. Is the person in the hallway back there, why don't you check and see if the tech guy can turn up the volume. So he's in between rooms, yeah. So what I'd like to do to start out with, actually, since especially with a full house like this, is in order to tailor what I have to say today, it would be really helpful for me if I knew pretty much the background that you folks are all coming from. So I'm going to ask you to just raise your hands when I name certain categories. Don't worry about whether it's specific to the only thing you do. I'm just interested in where you got your original training in acupuncture, or if you're in school, what kind of school it is. So let's start with the 5-element tradition. How many of you are 5-element oriented people? So looks like the back of the room, mostly. How many people here are coming from a more TCM front of the room? Okay, that's great. Anybody here from a Japanese acupuncture background? Nobody. Anybody here from a Korean acupuncture background? Initial training, yeah. Okay. So actually that's great because it looks like we're pretty evenly divided between TCM background and 5-element background, and I happen to come from a Korean acupuncture background. So hopefully I'll at least be able to tell you things that are new to you, to everybody here. So that's the first thing that I wanted to take care of. And the topic that is on the screen here is constitutional conditional acupuncture, treating both root and branch. And what I mean by that is it's a system of trying to approach acupuncture, I think, as a science rather than simply a collection of practices that people have done successfully for many years without having a firm connection to a body of what I consider scientific validity. We tend to think of science in the Western world as being a given body of knowledge and practice that excludes everything else. So something's either scientific or it's not, and that tends to be a very hot political way of labeling things, because the medical profession considers itself scientific, and everybody that doesn't buy into that is considered non-scientific and get devalued as a result of that, either by insurance programs or any of the other powerful social forces. And one of my goals in the work I do is to try to establish that science is not what people think it is. It's not the conventional field in which Western medicine has priority and can define that things are either what they say is science or they're not scientific. I think there are two kinds of science. One is Western and the other is Eastern, and they're complementary ways of looking at reality, but one is not more reality-based than the other. And that's what science is really about. Is something reality-based, or is it just something that people have put together and claim works, but have no way of explaining its history and how it's developed in terms of experimentation and validation over whatever period of time it's existed. So what I'm calling constitutional conditional acupuncture is actually a system of practice for acupuncture that I've developed. It's my personal approach to how I work with my patients, and I've been doing this for, well, it's taken me 45 years to get to where I am now, but what I'm going to be communicating today is reflecting the end point of that whole process. So some of it, I tend to be very content heavy rather than the opposite way around, the process oriented. And when I teach, I've recently figured out a way to make a better balance with that, but they don't allow me to do that here, which is I've been teaching in China the last 2 years, and the way that works there is every morning, actually this past year, I was in Beijing for 5 days, and it was a 5-day workshop, and the idea of talking for 5 days is just ridiculous, and I couldn't do it. But the way I structured it on their advice actually was every morning I would see patients exclusively, so that all the students would just be observing what was going on, and then in the afternoon I would explain what I had been doing, why I formulated the treatments I had, and then do practical exercises of my approach to diagnosis is very strongly pulse diagnosis oriented. So a lot of the exercises that I have people do relate to finger position and the different manipulations you can do with your fingers to get different kinds of information that are, in my way of working, very effective at arriving at a diagnosis. And one of the things I'd like to emphasize is, especially since we have a pretty even division here between TCM people and 5-element people, is that there is no one way that's correct for looking at understanding in Oriental medical terms what's going on with somebody. What we really do is in our various schools, we learn a particular lens, a way of looking at people that we're trained in, and it's important actually for a school to have a very solid, coherent integration of what they teach so that that lens becomes focused. And when you look through a focused lens, you see a very clear picture. But that doesn't mean that using different lenses is going to show you the wrong information. If you use a different kind of lens, you just get different information. And the more lenses you have, the more information you get. So if what you do is then stack up all these different bodies of knowledge and information you've gathered by using many different lenses, you get a much fuller picture of what's actually going on with somebody. So I'm hoping that by presenting this kind of material to you, I'll at least give you a chance to see the possibility of not being confined by the kind of training that you've had, still respecting it very highly. It's completely valid, but that there's a possibility of really broadening it so you can learn new skills that really give you lots of insights. And actually what I've experienced in my own life as an acupuncturist is that as time goes by, if you have that kind of attitude that what's out there is infinite and what I've been taught is finite, the longer you do it, it's kind of like life in general. As you get older, it seems to go faster, yeah? Same thing happens with learning diagnostic skills and therapeutic skills in acupuncture. As you keep going, if you don't give up, it gets faster and faster. So I'm learning new things faster now than I did 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. So those of you who know me probably know me best from the first actual book that I wrote, which was, it's probably more familiar to the Five Element people, In the Footsteps of the Yellow Emperor, which was an attempt to essentially, I wrote it originally as an attempt to try to figure out where J.R. Worsley had gotten his information from that he put together as his five-element approach to acupuncture. But in order to make it relevant to the rest of the world, I made that half of the book, and the other half was a survey of the history of acupuncture in general, so that people from outside the five-element tradition could see the relationship of Worsley's teachings to the rest of Chinese medicine and other versions of Oriental medicine. But actually, that wasn't the first thing that I wrote. Amos had mentioned Closing the Circle, which was an earlier, I'll call it a publication. Actually, it was an edited transcript of a series of classes I taught with a colleague, Stuart Cutchins, that looked at very early on the relationship of TCM to five-element practice, because I had gone to China early and after having studied in England. Almost nobody I knew back then knew anything about TCM. TCM wasn't even on the map when I started studying acupuncture. And so when I got back to the States, California was a hotbed of acupuncturists. It still is, actually. And everybody wanted to know, what is this stuff with TCM? We can't understand it. We don't have any clue as to what's going on. And so they asked me to set up a 3-day conference that would explain what TCM was from my short experience of getting some classes in China, and how it related to five elements. So that was published, the transcript of those classes was published as Closing the Circle. And even now, when I look back at that, I realize some of my current thinking is very, very strongly influenced by what I thought back then in the early days, including the idea of this parallel vision of constitution and condition as being separate aspects of what we look at when we evaluate our patients. Okay. How do I try to go through this? The fellow on the right here is Che Lu. He was one of my main Korean teachers. So as I mentioned early on, my initial training was with Korean acupuncturists, originally in Los Angeles, and then I moved up to the Bay Area. And in the Bay Area, Che Lu was the person that I mainly worked with. And I actually had a 10-year apprenticeship with him. And when he went to school, he studied at Kyunghee University in Korea, in Seoul. And one of his teachers, wasn't an official class, it was sort of like a continuing education thing that they let them do in the evening, was with a teacher called Guan Dewan, who in 1965 had published a paper on Korean constitutional acupuncture. And that was actually the first time, to my knowledge, that the word constitution came into the discourse of talking about acupuncture. But I had already been trained. I first studied with Korean teachers, but realized pretty quickly that there was a limit to how much I could learn from them for both language reasons and because of the lens that they looked through was, to my point of view, a limited lens. And when I was exposed to J.R. Worsley's teachings through, he came through California on a trip to attract students. I had met a number of his early graduates and found what they had to say very appealing, so I decided to go to school in England and realized that that lens that J.R. taught, which he called finding somebody's causative factor, the CF, was in many ways a very similar kind of concept to the Korean concept of constitutions. J.R. never called the CF a constitution, and he was always very sketchy about where people got their CF from. Was it something they were born with? Was it something that got formed by early childhood experiences? He never really committed himself on that, whereas a lot of his students, particularly the people who founded Kickham, John and Angie and Peter Mole, decided that no, it was pretty clear that this was constitutional and that it was something that was inherent in that person, and they came into life from that, which is very consonant with what the Korean position was. The problem is that J.R. broke the CF down into 5 different possibilities, the 5 elements, whereas the Korean system broke it down into 8 different constitutions. And so that was right off the bat enough to drive me crazy for many years, is how do you manage those different ways of looking at people's constitution that are so, it's not even comparing even numbers to other even numbers. You know, you can't go from 2 to 4 to 6 or something like that. It's 5 and 8 are just totally immiscible. They don't work together. So that's probably what started me on the path towards developing the idea of constitutional conditional acupuncture, was trying to come to terms with what is a person's CF or constitution? What does that mean? So one of the things I'd maybe like to do, so I'm not just completely talking all the time, is does anybody have any idea of what does anybody here read Chinese or have any experience with Chinese characters? A few, very few people. Okay, there's a few of you. So if you look in the classics, do you know what concept or what term in Chinese corresponds to constitution? Concept. Yeah, but what word in Chinese? Ganying is resonance. Yeah, but what resonance is different than constitution? Chunlong? I'm not familiar with that one. Well, actually, the ones that most people, let's see where I don't have no idea how I organized this. I'll probably come back to that. This was the fellow who invented the 8-type Korean constitutional acupuncture, and that was actually only in 1965 that was introduced, so it was relatively late in history. And this was obviously J.R. Worsley in his early years. This was during his formative trip to the Hong Kong and Taiwan in 1966, where he really put his system together. And this was my first trip to China in 1981 that led to that little pamphlet, the class that I mentioned, of Closing the Circle. So that's what this was. It was just a quick historical background. And I went through JR's training program all the way through the MEC level, and then afterwards he did consultations that I worked with, so it's post MAC level. And I have to admit to all of you, his whole system of his way of diagnosing things through color, sound, odor, and emotion, I am just awful at. I was awful at it back in my first days in 1974, and I'm still awful at it today. And a lot of what's driven me over the years was not that I didn't believe in it, it's just that I noticed that people have different gifts, that we all come into life with different capacities, and maybe it's our destinies are different. And so I just didn't have very good gifts at that. I could look at almost anybody and see all 5 colors, sounds, odors, and emotions in everybody. And I remember, even in class, we would actually take votes on the patients that were presented in class. People would vote on which CF this person was. I don't remember a single case where the majority vote was the same one as JR came up with. And what struck me about that was, if this is so controversial, how can we make it a reliable system? Not that I ever doubted that there was something real behind it, because I could see in clinic, people got better. There was no question that it worked. The question was, how am I going to get it to work for me? And at the beginning, I did spend a lot of time using my best effort at color, sound, odor, and emotion to diagnose patients. And I had a successful practice, but I never felt fulfilled by it. I think a lot because I had that doubt that I was kind of guessing all the time. Is this fragrant, or is this grief? It's just, for me, it was a guessing game. And I remember actually once at a big conference in the East Coast in New York, I think it was in Washington, D.C., or it was one of the East Coast cities, where a number of very famous practitioners from around the world gathered at a symposium at which a patient, I think it was just one patient, there might have been 2 patients, were diagnosed individually by each of these famous practitioners, and they gave their diagnosis and their prescription for treatment, how they would treat them. And JR was at this meeting, but he didn't volunteer to be one of the diagnosers. He asked Julia Measures to do that for him. And I was sitting near the front there where she was, and I remember her going, JR, I can't do this, I can't do this, I don't know, what is it? I'm just too nervous to be able to do this. I'm not that good at it. And JR said, don't worry about it, just whatever you think you see, just say it. And just say it as if that's what it is. Don't question yourself. And later, as it turned out, Julia came up with what I think was a very, very useful outcome from that process, which was that she did not expect herself to get the CF in the initial visit. She said, give me 10 visits and I will tell you what a patient's CF is. But on the first visit, I could easily be 180 degrees off the correct answer. It's really the response of the patient to the different things that I do in treatment that will tell me what the CF is. And so in a way, I felt very validated by that, because it confirmed for me that I wasn't the only one that wasn't able to get color, sound, odor, and emotion like that. I didn't have that confidence. On the other hand, I know practitioners who rely totally on that and feel very confident about doing it on their first visit. And I could name several right off the bat that that's what they do. They look at people and listen to them, smell them, and they know what their CF is. So I think people do have that gift. I'm just not one of them. So this was when I fellow Dr. Guan that I mentioned, developing Korean constitutional acupuncture in 1965, fascinated me. I read his paper and talked to people who had been trained by him. Actually, several of my initial Korean teachers had learned his methodology, and so I had a chance to discuss it with them. And I was very fortunate, because of my Korean contacts, to get invited to his clinic. So Stuart Cutchins, who was the guy basically who founded the NCCA in the States, and myself were, as far as I know, the only Americans, maybe the only Caucasians, who ever got invited to sit in with Dr. Guan at his clinic and watch him practice. And on a number of trips, I had the opportunity to do that, up until the point that he discovered that Stuart and I were actually aware of what he was up to. Initially he was just doing us a favor because we had connections, we had Korean connections, and he was just being nice. When he discovered that we actually were taking notes, writing down what points he was stimulating and what the patient's condition was and why he used certain points, he actually this actually happened because Stuart asked him a question about one of the patients that he treated, at which point he realized that we really understood what he was doing, and he turned ghastly white. That's the only time I've actually seen white. He turned white and for a few minutes couldn't say anything at all, and finally said, "Okay, I will tell you, I will answer your question, but you have to promise me that you will not tell this material to anybody else until I've had a chance to share it." This is now, I don't know how many decades ago, and he's recently come out. Originally his plan was he was going to write a textbook on his methodology, and I was going to be the editor of the English version. And for years he kept telling me, "Yeah, I'm working on it, I'm working on it." Just in the last few years he said, "I don't think it's going to happen." And so at this point I feel kind of liberated from that promise that, well, if he's not going to share it, then I don't feel beholden to not share what I think of that and what I've learned from him. So anyway, this was us in his clinic watching him treat actually one of the Korean monks, who's quite a famous person in Korea. Actually, it's very interesting that I was here 4 years ago at this very venue, talking about resonance and spirit. I did 2 presentations, and also possession and the 7 dragons. And both of those, you'll see, will be coming up in one way or another in what I have to say today. So about 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, no, 3 years, actually from that, let me go back to that slide. So at this conference, I don't know if were any of you here then, 4 years ago? You may have noticed there was a Chinese gentleman, He Ting, who was walking around with a camera taking videos of everybody that was teaching. And he was particularly interested in what I was talking about and had me on camera and kept in touch with me afterwards and invited me. He's actually an anthropologist at Yunnan University of Chinese Medicine, and his area of interest is how acupuncture migrated to the West, which is exactly what the Footsteps of the Yellow Emperor was about. So he knew about me even beforehand. He had seen my book. And each year he holds a conference in Yunnan at his school, his university, devoted to the different parts of acupuncture that have migrated to the West. And his conviction is the same as mine, actually, that the West has preserved a lot of the ancient knowledge that's contained in the classics that has no longer been paid attention to in most TCM institutions in China. and that it's really important for the Chinese to pay attention to what we do here so that they can get back their own heritage. So he invited me to come to one of his yearly, what he called forums about, the original one that year was about the work of Jacques Lavier, who was one of Worsley's teachers. So I couldn't make it that year. There wasn't any funding, and I just couldn't work it out schedule-wise. So I did it by Skype presentation, and it was very nice. And little by little, we built a very nice relationship with each other. And the following year, so this was in 2017, he invited me, he actually got funding to invite me to come to the next forum. And I said to him, well, that's very nice. I'd be happy to go, it'd be, really nice to go to China and give a speech at your forum. But I kind of get a little bit bored with just giving talks. You saw what I did in the 2014 conference here. I'd like a chance to actually show what my methodology is like. So how about if I do a pre-conference seminar workshop and actually demonstrate what I do when I work with patients? And he said, great, let's do that. And that's what evolved into my teaching in China. And so I did that 3-day workshop in Kunming, and then this last year, I did a 5-day workshop in Beijing. So this conference 4 years ago was actually a very important part of my evolution. And in this coming about, Horting organized in Paris in 2017 a new organization that was devoted to studying the transmission from the east to the west of Chinese medicine. And that's me down in the right-hand corner there next to Horting is the fellow right next to me, and this is Gilles André, who's the president currently of the French Acupuncture Association. These are all very important people, mostly French, who are basically working on trying to bring back to China a lot of this information. And it was on the basis of this that I got that invitation to teach in China. So this was from my first workshop there, treating a patient. And I wrote about, I saw a number of patients and actually wrote an article for the Journal of Chinese Medicine that got published describing all of the patients that I treated. And this is an important issue for me. Again, if you remember, I started out by talking about things being scientific in any kind of field of practice. So what I did when I wrote this article is I decided I want to present every single case that I treated when I was in China, not pick and choose the ones that worked and the ones that didn't work. As it turned out, they all worked. I was very lucky. But when I submitted the article, I actually had more cases because afterwards I took the time to go on vacation there, and there were a bunch of these French people that came for the forum that traveled with me in Sichuan province, and they all wanted me to treat them, so I treated them and their family and everything. So I had a whole bunch of cases, and I submitted them all in this article, and the journal editor said, that's too big, I can't do this. And he told me, use this case, that case, that case, and that case. And I said, no, I'm not going to do that. What I'll do is I'll cut out all the extra cases after the seminar was over, after my class was over. But if I'm going to publish this, you have to put in every case I did, because what I want to show is how consistent and reliable the methodology that I use is. And he agreed, and so that's anybody who's interested in this issue of the journal, you can read all the cases that there's an explanation of what I'm talking about today, but also all the cases that I presented with the rationale of why I treated them the way I did. And then this year, as I said, I got invited to Beijing to do a longer class and also give a presentation at Beijing University. And this was one of my patients, actually, was a person who had a lung cancer. She didn't actually even know she had lung cancer because her daughter thought it would freak her out too much to know the truth. She just thought she had some kind of benign tumor. But I treated her there, and she was very, very happy with the results of treatment. So as I said before, I'm not very good at color, sound, odor, and emotion, and I thought about, okay, if I'm going to become a competent acupuncturist, what skill can I develop if I don't have those other skills that will get me to the same place? And I realized that the most time-honored diagnostic process in Chinese medicine has always been pulse diagnosis right from the very beginning. Maybe a close second is color, complexion, but complexion and pulse have always been right at the bedrock of classical Chinese medicine. And so I decided that I'd also failed at pulse diagnosis, in addition to color, sound, odor, and emotion. I tried many times studying with teachers about pulse diagnosis, and all of them, their way, JR's method of pulse diagnosis, I think, was derived from Japanese sources, from my own understanding, and that was basically a plus-minus volume assessment of pulses are stronger or weaker. Whereas all the other pulse diagnosis classes I attended had to do with learning pulse qualities. And neither one of those proved very useful to me. I couldn't feel like I could rely on them to say, I'm taking this pulse and I really understand what it is and what it means. And I sat with that for a long time, realizing that pulse diagnosis had been such an important part of Chinese medicine that there must be something in it. And I just have to be thankful that whatever gods helped me along the way, at some point I realized that the Chinese were not the only people who recognized how important pulse diagnosis was, that there were many other people. As I told you, my Korean master that developed this eight constitutions method, his only, I'd say 95% of his diagnosis is based on the pulse. So, but taking it in a very different place than the Chinese take it. It's up on the arm, and I'll get to that later. And then I did some further research. I also studied with a different Korean system called hand acupuncture, and they use the carotid radial pulse diagnosis, which comes straight out of the Neijing. And in my wider reading about alternative medicine, I realized that Ayurvedic medicine from India also uses pulse diagnosis. And so I had learned a little bit about Ayurvedic medicine and realized at some point that there was a correspondence between the Korean hand acupuncture diagnostic system, which is called Three Constitutions theory, and the three constitutions in Ayurvedic medicine, which are Vata, Pitta, and Kapha dosha. And so I actually wrote an article in the American Journal of Acupuncture many, many years ago, proposing that this is a great place to look for connections between the various branches of Eastern medicine, because they both have a three-part system, and you could probably make a Rosetta Stone to translate findings in one system into those in another system. And I said, I'm not trained in Ayurvedic pulse diagnosis or Ayurvedic medicine. Won't somebody please pick it up that knows what they're doing and see if it works? 10 years went by and nobody responded to it. So eventually I looked around and found an Ayurvedic pulse teacher, and decided, okay, I have to learn Ayurvedic pulse diagnosis. And so I did that. I studied a number of years with an Ayurvedic teacher and got into lots of arguments with her because I disagreed with her findings. Eventually, I realized that I was seeing things that I had never seen before. And let's see how. So what I wanted to show in this slide was that there are many, many different ways of doing pulse diagnosis. So I don't know if all of you are familiar. How many people here have actually read the classics of Chinese medicine, the Suen, the Neijing, the Nanjing, the Meijing? Anybody? Very small minority. My opinion is I think it's essential that any school that trains people in acupuncture has to get their students to read the classics of Chinese medicine, even if it's just in translation. Better if they teach them a little bit of Chinese so that they can understand the characters, but at least to read the classics. You're not going to learn to practice Chinese medicine from the classics. You do need to learn it the way they teach it in schools, but knowing the classics gives you perspective on what the original people who developed these ideas were thinking about. And that's very important because I don't know if how many of you know this, but for instance, in the Neijing, the radial pulse diagnosis is not described at all. It's not in there. There's a way, I will actually go out on a limb and say I think it is in there in a very hidden way. It's never described as pulse diagnosis, but the actual relationships of this is next to this is next to this correspond very closely to where the radial pulses for the different officials or organs or meridians are. So I think it is hidden in there, but actually the system of pulse diagnosis in the Neijing is the first one up here. It's called the Renying Sunggu pulse diagnosis, or comparing the carotid and radial arteries. So that's an important part of what I do and what I'm going to show you today. And I'll skip over for the moment the number 2 there. It's not really a pulse diagnosis thing. I'll come back to it. And then the Meijing, which is is the Chinese word for pulse. It actually means either pulse or vessel, but it's the same character. And it's the classic of the pulses. And there's a very interesting chapter. It's actually the last chapter in the Meijing that gives a totally different set of correspondences for what officials, what organs in the body each of the 3 pulse positions on each wrist correspond to. And almost everybody that looks at it goes, this is crazy, I don't understand this at all. But actually it makes a lot of sense, and I'll show you why. The Nanjing, which is the classic of difficulties, oops, let me go back to that here. The Nanjing, also in chapter 5, has been very, very important to me in my work, in that it actually, the Nanjing, for those of, this is probably of more interest, closer to the heart of the 5-element people, is really the classic of 5-element acupuncture, because chapter 5 goes into very specific descriptions of how you tell what element is represented at each level of the pulse under each finger. And if you know that, you are so far ahead of the game in terms of understanding what's going on with each patient. You know, is the lung influenced by the earth element? Is the lung influenced by the water element? All of those things are very exact, and they're right there in the pulse. But it's a very different system that you learn in the 5-element schools. 5-element schools are teaching superficial and deep, right? For the superficial or the hollow organs and the deeper the solid organs. My experience, and it's backed up by the Nanjing, is that that's not the best way of understanding what's superficial and what's deep. That actually there are 5 levels, not 2, and that those 5 levels correspond exactly to the 5 elements. And so superficial is the metal element, it's not the hollow organs. And I'll go over that. So let me go back to number 2 for a minute. I'm going to vary it a little bit because it's not really, I don't want to talk about the finger size for the moment. What I want to talk about is the locations, finger locations. There are actually, if you look at it, and I'll get to this in the slides in a little bit, probably most of you, actually I'd be curious, those of you in the front who are the TCM people, just show me, I'm just curious, show me on yourself, where do you put your fingers for the 3 positions that you check the pulse at? I'm just going to take a minute to look at where you put your fingers. Okay, yeah, let me just feel where you're, okay. Okay, yeah, so you're a little bit distal to the wrist crease. Yeah, is everybody, you're up at the wrist crease, okay. You're a little bit distal. Are you? Yeah, you're a little bit distal. Okay, so we'll get to that. So there's actually 2 major schools of thought about where to put your fingers for the first 3 positions. Worsley taught that the fingers go with the middle finger right over the styloid process. The index finger goes right up against the base of the scaphoid bone at the wrist crease, and the little finger goes right next to the middle finger, right? There's a very popular Chinese teacher in the States called Jimmy Chang. I don't know if any of you are familiar with him. He's more an herbalist. He actually was originally trained as an acupuncturist, but he's more popular and more as time goes by, works as an herbalist. And he says, no, that's crazy. The correct place is to put the styloid process, the crest, right between your index and middle finger, so that he's making all 3 fingers a little bit more proximal. When I come across things like that, my brain starts to go round in circles and say, how can that be? How can somebody do it this way and the other person does it that way and everybody gets good results? There must be an answer to it. I don't make anybody wrong. I just need to get some kind of satisfaction for myself. Yeah, you had a question. You have a different location.
I have come across a few patients have.
Oh, an abdomen. Yeah. There are people that have just for yourself, not for your patients.
Some of my patients also.
Some, yeah, but not most.
Many.
Yeah. So this young lady was just saying that she has an aberrant radial artery that goes over the dorsum of her wrist, and I've had a number of patients. In fact, I have one who has it on both sides, and so it's absolutely impossible to take her radial pulses. I have to use other ways to treat her. Yeah, that's a different question. So what I realized is that JR was a pure acupuncturist. He didn't use herbs, he didn't know herbs, didn't teach herbs. He was just about acupuncture. Jimmy Chang, although he knows acupuncture, is really, if you actually study with him and take classes, and he's got an online group, it's 100% herbal medicine. If you think about what is the difference between acupuncture and herbal medicine, they're both parts of Chinese medicine, but what is the difference between them? Anybody have any feeling about what's the important difference in the nature of those 2 modalities? Acupuncture is energetic and herbal medicine is? Yeah, so the way I look at it is one's more material and one's more non-material, right? So you can call it energetic or non-material, and this will go back to the fundamental ideas in Chinese medicine about Wu Ji and Tai Chi and pre-heaven and post-heaven, and lots of different ways of looking at those things as the manifest and the non-manifest aspects of life. So acupuncture is, the position JR taught, is more distal, and herbal medicine is more proximal. What's the difference between proximal and distal? Anytime you get two things, the theory you use to look at it is the yin-yang theory, right? More distal is more yang, more proximal is more yin. Acupuncture is more yang, herbal medicine is more yin. It's substance. Acupuncture is not substance, it's energy or process. So what I realized is that you're getting different, like I said before, these are lenses. You're using different lenses to look at what's going on. And by using both of them, not choosing between one or the other, but by using both of them, you get twice the information. And that was my initial understanding of those two different finger positions. Now I've actually come to an even more useful understanding of those finger positions, which is that the more distal position, which you learn in the five-element tradition, actually represents the more yang officials, which are the hollow organs. And so if you use the Nanjing method that I'm going to show you of the 5 depths at the more distal finger positions for the 3 fingers, you're getting the information about the hollow organs. So you don't have to go superficial versus deep to feel Fu and Zang officials. You can use finger position. The distal finger position is the yang hollow organs. The proximal finger position is the yin solid organs. And if you think about it, when you look at the herbal medicine texts, almost 90+% of what they talk about is treating the Zang organs. Very little, what are the syndromes that you learn? Liver stagnation, kidney yin or yang deficiency, heart blood deficiency. How many of you learn gallbladder patterns? Very few gallbladder patterns, very few urinary bladder patterns. It's all about the Zang officials. And that's where the pulses are showing that. So if you put your fingers in that more proximal position, you'll get real exact information about what the solid Zang organs or officials are doing. So those two lenses are very, very important. So that's what I'm calling here the non-yin yang pulses and the Nanjing yin pulses. And then if we have time, hopefully I'll explain to you a little bit about the Ayurvedic pulses and the Korean pulses. But there's so much to cover, and 3 hours is not nearly enough. I've already spent, an hour, and haven't said very much. If you're interested in what I'm saying today, this is the book that's available downstairs that has a lot more information, but it was written 4 years ago. I've changed some of the things since then, so it's not 100% up to date, but at least 95% of what I wrote in there I still hold to, and it's really capable of giving you a grounding in my approach. Okay, so one of the things I'd like to go, now I'm really just about starting my presentation now, is what is the reason we do acupuncture? What are we expecting to accomplish when we treat people? So obviously the word is we want to help them be healthier. because that's what people come to us, is they feel like they're not healthy and they would like some assistance with their health problems. The question is, what is health? What does it mean to be healthy? What does it mean to not be healthy? That's a subject that's very rarely talked about in any of the courses I've ever taken. They just assume that people know what that means. But I think almost nobody knows what it means. And I have my own ideas about what I think it means. So, and that has a lot to do with why I developed this constitutional conditional approach. What I think being healthy means is each of us comes into life with an original nature, right? So if you look in the Neijing, it tells you that the two essences of mother and father come together, and there's the spirit. The spirit appears. In so many words, that's just what it says. The two Jing join, and the spirit appears. So what I think is happening there is that we each have a very unique individual nature. We may resemble each other in certain ways. Otherwise, we couldn't classify ourselves as having 5 different CFs. We couldn't classify ourselves as having 8 different constitutions. So there must be some resemblance, but everybody knows intuitively that no two people are alike exactly. Those are just groupings, they're families. So when that unique individual is conceived, they have one part that's material, that's the Jing, the essence from their parents, and one part that's immaterial, the Shen, that comes from heaven. One part's coming from earth, and one part's coming from heaven. And the reason that a particular Shen comes into this combination of Jing is by resonance, exactly like the attraction between the north and south pole of a magnet. They pull each other, and when you get a strong magnetic pull, you can't separate them. They just hold on for dear life. And that's exactly what it is. It's dear life, because if you separate them, life is gone. Okay? So that's what a lot of, I think, the process of living and dying is about, is how well the Shen and the Jing are able to stay bonded to each other. Can your physical body support your immaterial Shen? So we all start out life with this original nature. And what this original nature is, we all intuitively understand. It's who we are. It's what, when people say, oh, there's John over there, John knows who John is. He never changes throughout his life. He's always John. And that's his original nature. And we each have one of those. We give it a name. We call ourselves by a given name. The name isn't who we are, but who we feel we are is who we actually are. And when we're healthy, we just say, we use expressions like, I feel like myself. I feel healthy, I feel like myself. And when we stop feeling like ourselves, we often will say something like that. We'll say something like, I don't feel like myself today, right? That's what being not healthy is about, is when we don't feel like ourselves anymore. So on the one hand, our self is our constitution. That's what endures throughout our whole life. It never changes, whether we're young, old, sick, ill, healthy, Superman, trained for the Olympics, doesn't matter. That self never changes. What changes is how our condition is doing. Is our condition matching and binding with our constitution, reflecting it? Or have we developed what I call a condition, that's the way I use the word condition, is in a more pathological sense, that when that does not match our constitution, we don't feel like ourselves anymore. Here's our constitution, and our condition is off doing something else. that's not us anymore, and we don't like it. We don't feel well. We don't feel like ourselves. Yeah, sure.
That sensation, that feeling of self, do you attribute it more to the Shen part, or maybe to the Jing part, or to the combination?
The combination. Yeah. I don't think you ultimately can really ever separate them. Just like I said, it's like two poles of a magnet that attract. The Shen and the Jing attract each other specifically because they complement each other, and there's no difference in what they're projecting. They're just one material and the other's immaterial, but they're projecting the same thing. Okay? So here we have the Constitution, here we have the condition that's not where the Constitution is at. What we want to do in treatment is give the information necessary to nudge the condition back towards matching the Constitution. If it does that, then we feel like ourselves again. We feel like ourselves, we're healthy. We could be dying of cancer, but if we feel like ourselves, we're healthy. Okay, so it's not about the Western concept of illness. It's about who are we and are we being ourselves? Because even if we're suffering, and all the religions in the world tell you about life as suffering, even if we're suffering, if in that process we're true to ourselves, the suffering is not intolerable. It's we recognize it and we figure out how to cope with it. And that's okay. And there are techniques in acupuncture to do that anyway, because we can treat the conditions that people develop, which is forms of suffering. But if we can get them to where they're actually feeling like themselves again, it's much, much, much easier to deal with whatever illness they have. So that's my goal in treatment. So what I do, I'll recognize you in a second. What I do is I separately diagnose via the pulse mostly a person's constitution, and separately what is their present condition. And then from that I devise a treatment, and there are many, many different ways you can devise treatments that will encourage their present condition to gravitate back towards their constitutional original nature. And my experience is when you do that, people are very happy. They like it, they feel good, and their health improves. So that's the basic idea that I'm working out of. Yeah.
I was just going to ask, I know that you know a lot of the practice five element style, but in terms of the separation between the Shen and the Jing, how often do you see, you talk about that separation and bringing them back to their original nature, how do you still do things like major blocks like IVC, because that's obviously theories that that's the big separation between
Uh-huh. Great question. I'm glad you answered it. First off, let me say that IDs, EDs, and possession has absolutely nothing to do with the five-element acupuncture theory. JR got it from one of his teachers in Taiwan, who was not a five-element practitioner. And if you think about it, it's not a five-element concept. It's not about the five elements. Okay? It is about the spirit, which was very important to JR, but it's not about five elements. Second part of the answer is, yes, I think about it a lot, that it's one of the most powerful treatments you'll ever do when it's the correct treatment, but you can diagnose it in the pulse, which is what I do. JR taught to diagnose it by the eyes, and he also taught a lot of his students do it on everybody because you don't want to miss it. I think that's a big mistake. In fact, there's currently, I don't know how many of you people use Facebook. There's a Facebook group called Five Element Acupuncturists, I think, that just this week has been running a thread that was started by an acupuncture student who she a student or a practitioner? I think she's a recently graduated practitioner who had an AE tap done on her and got really messed up. It started a few days after that, but she was really, really messed up and couldn't understand it, and she was messed up for a while, not just for a day or two. And so she posted that and she said, does anybody know about this? Has anybody else experienced this, and do they have any understanding of it? And there were a couple of answers, mostly of the sort that I don't like, which is people saying, well, it happened a couple of days afterwards. It's probably had nothing to do with the acupuncture. I tend to take the opposite view, that everything that happens to my patients, I did it to them. That's a very Confucian way of approaching the practice of medicine, that you're on the spot when you have a patient. If it's not your patient, you're not responsible. But once they're your patient, if something's going on with them, it's your responsibility to take care of it. So in any case, I did, after all these people gave their answers, I happened to come across this thread, which I don't look at it that often, but at the site that often, but I came across this week, and I wrote her, I posted on that thread, and I said, see if I remember what I said. I'm blanking a little bit, but I said something like that when you do an AE tap, what you're doing is putting needles in the bladder meridian. Doesn't matter that they're shallow. You're putting needles in the bladder meridian, and you're letting them sit there for a long time very often. If somebody has a really weak bladder official, you're draining that bladder official's energy. So I said to her, is there any way in which you, in the days that followed this AE tap, did anything at all that might have called on your bladder to be more active? Did you do anything or experience anything that might have affected your bladder official? And she wrote back really quickly and she said, does fear have anything to do with it? And I said, absolutely. And she wrote back afterwards, she said, thank you. I finally understand it. I'm a very fearful person. That's really what's been going on with me. Now I understand it. I'm at peace with it. And I don't know how I got onto that. It was because of the question about the devils and the dragons. So I very, very much believe in that diagnosis. I don't believe that it has anything. I don't necessarily believe that it has anything to do with real possession. What I think it has to do with is it's a dysfunction of the Shen-Jing mechanism in the human body. And we have two kinds of Jing. We have inherited Jing, which is the kidney's responsibility, and we have acquired Jing, which is the spleen, pancreas's responsibility. And if you think about it, the kidney is the water element. The points that get treated for the external possession are all on the bladder meridian, which is the water element. The spleen pancreas is the earth element. The points that get treated on internal dragons are all on the stomach meridian, which is the earth element. You're just using the yang organ of the element that's involved in either the inherited Jing or the acquired Jing to help this person who's lost the ability of their Jing to connect to their Zheng Qi, their circulating Qi, right? And hopefully I'll have time to circle back to this, but our Jing Shen, really is a better way of describing it, is a good stand-in for what I'm calling original nature, right? Our original nature is when the Jing and the Shen come together. That's who we are. If you lose contact with that, you're in big trouble. It's not just that you're not completely matched to it, you've lost complete contact with it. That's what being possessed is about, is when you no longer have access to who you are. And that's why it's called possession. If you're not who you are, who are you? You know, so it could be somebody else, another spirit, or somebody else's idea of who you should be. You know, what your teacher tells you you are, what your parents tell you you are, etc. All of those are forms of possession if you buy into it. So what I tell my patients is that I'm going to give them a treatment to help them remember what they've forgotten, which is who they are, and that they should pay attention to how they feel after the treatment and see if they recognize something about themselves that they've forgotten, that they used to feel, but somehow have forgotten. And actually in the Complete Acupuncturist, there's one case history of one of my patients who was suicidally depressed. She wanted to kill herself, but felt guilty about it, and so wasn't ready to act yet, but it was not because she didn't want to kill herself. She just felt that it was immoral or something, or she was afraid, but she really didn't want to live anymore. And she actually, by pulse diagnosis, because I can't do it through the eyes, she actually was internally possessed, had the internal dragons. I did the treatment, and she completely recovered. You know, she stopped being suicidal, went back to school, got married, had a very happy life. You know, I had to repeat it occasionally, when she lost it again, but very rarely. I think I've treated her 2 or 3 times, and she's been quite well ever since. And the pulse that I diagnosed immediately, as soon as I put the needles in, immediately changed to her normal, to who she was. Yeah. Okay. So let's see. Where are we? I'm going to come back to all of this later. I want to try to answer the question. Oh, let me do this first. I will come back to the question, but I asked you before to show me where you put your fingers. So this is a typical Worsley orientation of the fingers. This is a typical herbal place. And you can see fingers spread more, and the index finger is not at the wrist crease, which would have been here. It's not here, it's over here. Where is it? Here. I hope I have a slide of it here. I'm pretty sure I do. Here it is. Okay, so this is from the Nanjing, chapter 5 of the Nanjing, that tells you, it correlates what depth of pulse. They actually talk about it in terms of beams of pressure that the fingers exert. And what they say is that if you exert 3 beams of pressure, so you see it's not right at the surface of the skin, it's below, but if you exert 3 beams of pressure, you will feel the pulse reflecting the metal element, which shows as lung, large intestine, skin, you all know the associations of the metal element. If you exert twice as much pressure, so now you're at 6 beams of pressure, you'll feel the pulse of the fire element. At 9 beams of pressure, the earth element. At 12 beams of pressure, the wood element. And if you're right above the bone, you're all the way down at the bottom, you're at the water element. In people who are internally possessed, all of their pulses at Sun, Guan, and Shi in the yang pulse position, which is why you're treating them on the yang organs, while you're treating bladder and stomach in possession. In the yang finger position, in internal possession, where is this? All of the pulses at Sun, Guan, and Shi will be at this middle earth level. Okay? That's not normal. Your pulse at each finger should be at the depth that's appropriate for the element that shows up at that under that finger. So on the left-hand side, the index finger feels the heart and small intestine, right? That's the fire element. It should be at the fire element depth, which is over here, 6 beams of pressure. It should not be down here. Same is true for all of the positions. They have the correct place or depth that they should be at.
So you're saying you'll only feel at a depth?
It'll feel widest at the middle depth. That's where it's clearest and widest. When you take the pulse and you go up and down, that's where you'll say, this is where the pulse is at. A pulse is a wave. That's where you'll feel the wave clearest. And it's like tuning a radio. You tune the radio until you get the clearest signal. And that's what you're doing when you're feeling pulses. You're looking for the clearest signal. Okay? The same is true in principle for people who are externally possessed. But here, instead of their pulses all being at the middle level, they'll all be at this depth at the water level, at the just above the bone level. All 12, all 6, three on the left hand, 3 on the right hand, all be at the water level. You know they're possessed with the external demons. Okay? So the way I think of that is that the external possession has to do with a problem of the inherited jing communicating to the body, to the person, and the internal possession has to do with the acquired jing communicating with the person. And they both have to be available because you're born with a very limited amount of inherited jing. So all your acquired jing has to model itself on the inherited jing. And then the acquired jing is what gets sent out to all the 12 organs to tell them this is who you are. If they're not doing that, they don't know who they are. They're going to just do whatever they feel like doing, and whatever somebody else tells them they should be doing, like your mother. So it's very important that both of those links be present, that the inherited jing can talk to the acquired jing, and that the acquired jing can talk to the officials.
Can I just ask, the inherited thing, if you've got parents with poor health and maybe conceived late in life and your inherited thing is relatively weak, if the gene that you take from your finger talks to that, are you saying that you would overall be weak from the inherited thing?
The only experience that I can really relate to around that is the issue of people that are born with congenital illnesses. I haven't come to terms with that yet myself as to what that means. And what I mean by congenital illnesses is actually what I think the word means. It's not people that are born deformed in some way, but people that are conceived deformed in some way. There is a difference. They can develop in utero problems that are still not them. It's something they've acquired, but they've acquired it in utero. I'm not sure that people who are born with what you say parents who have weak jing, I'm not even sure what you mean by that. People abuse themselves in life continually. How common is it to be an alcoholic, to eat poorly, to work too hard? So that that goes back to the old question of what do people in common parlance mean by somebody's constitution. In common speech, we talk about somebody having a strong constitution or a weak constitution. That's a totally different concept than somebody's inborn nature. All right? Okay. So we're going to take a break in 5 minutes, but this is a very important point. I'm not sure what you mean by your parents had weak constitutions. Maybe you would care to elaborate on what you mean by that.
Yeah, Jim. So
Yeah, how are you determining that they had weak Jing?
well, just from at conception, if the parents were older and lesser health, perhaps what they passed on to their child was not as strong as if they'd been younger and more healthy.
I'm not sure I buy that. I think that if they were capable of parenting a child, their Jing was just fine. Yeah. Okay.
In assisted reproduction.
It's the same thing. It's a question of whether the individual is born with a complement of Jing and Shen that makes them a unique individual. I don't think, in fact, I think if you, I don't know if this study has been done, but if you look at kids who were born of assisted reproduction methods compared to kids that were born naturally and looked at their health pattern throughout life, assisted reproduction is a relatively modern experience. So I don't think we even have the data yet long term to determine health outcomes. But I'm not convinced that those kids are any less healthy than kids, I think what happens is a lot of people try assisted reproduction and they're failures. They don't end up, they end up aborting, or they end up not conceiving at all, depending on what kind of assisted reproduction they have. That's where the problem comes in. Nature says, no, this is not workable.
Lisa Rossi is about to start a study on it.
Yeah, well, that's great. Yeah, I think it's a good question, but we need to look at the data. I don't think you can answer it intellectually. I think you need to look at the data. Okay, so we only have a few minutes left before, or a minute left before break. If there are any other questions at this point, that's a good.
You might be covering this later on, but using the 5 elements system, I know that your book talks about CF diagnosis through the pulse. I was just wondering whether you might be able to cover that.
CF diagnosis through the pulse. Yes, I will cover it. Any other questions? Is that clock right? It's not right? Two minutes.
Is the pericardium at the same level as the heart level then?
Good question. Yes, the answer is no. The question is the pericardium pulse supposed to be at the heart fire level or at the kidney water level? The answer is it's supposed to be at the water level. Okay? It's not a water official. I'm not saying it's a water official. It's just its correct level is all the way down by the bone, deep. Yeah. And the reason, I think, is that it's reflecting the Mingmun function, which is, Mingmun is right between the two kidneys. It's a fire official, but it has to do a lot with the balance between fire and water, and its location is much more to do with the kidneys than it is to do with the heart. Okay, so let us reconvene in a half hour. Thank you.